Okay, so this is our Simon Dome reading group coming back after a bit of a hiatus. Merry Christmas and happy holidays to everyone listening. We are picking up from the text analysis of the criteria of individuality within volume 2 of Individuation. So that is page 653 in the PDF version. So I'll just mention before we get into it quickly that the order of the text is a little bit different in the translation versus the French version. I'm not sure exactly why they sort of move things around, but in the French version, there's the text form information potentials comes first, and then analysis of the criteria of individuality, and then allegmatics. But then in the English translation, they put analysis of the criteria of individuality first, and then I think allegmatics comes next, and then form information potentials. So I'm not sure what the reason for that was, but if anyone's following along in the French translation, that just be aware that there's this difference of order. And then there's also this little note at the beginning of the text in the translation, which is not in the French version. So I'm not sure where exactly this comes from. It looks like it's an editorial addition of some kind, but it indicates that this text analysis of the criteria of individuality is a sort of preliminary version of what eventually became Individuation Volume 1, or a first draft of what ended up becoming Individuation Volume 1. So this text is a sort of methodological text. It looks at what is the method for studying individuation and like how do we go about studying what an individual is, and so we'll see as we get into this text what Simondon's sort of outline of an answer is, and then we can try to compare that to what he actually ends up doing in Individuation Volume 1. Okay, so I will read the first page or so, and then we can discuss as usual. Okay, preliminary note. The object of this study is inseparable from its method. A relation of reciprocal conditions in fact links the reality of its object to the validity of the approach undertaken. We are utilizing a single postulate that has an ontological signification and a logical or epistemological value. Indeed, we suppose that veritable relation is an integral part of being. This postulate should not be considered as resorting to a method or doctrine that supposes the identity of the rational and the real. We are instead attempting to show that dialectical systems do not contribute a profound enough critique of the notion of substance, and that a latent substantialism has not allowed these systems to think the reality of the individual adequately. Furthermore, we are essentially trying to indicate before beginning the study of the individual that this labor will attempt to unfold in the hypothesis that neither realism nor nominalism are rigorously legitimate. This labor would like to lead to a critique of universals, and particularly to a reevaluation of the thought that supposes classification based on common genera and specific differences. According to the doctrine that will be presented, the generic or specific characteristics are an integral part of the individual in the same way as the most singular elements that distinguish an individual from other individuals. The epistemological consequence of this inquiry would be the following. There can be no science unless it is a science of the individual. A new normativity may be discovered based on this consequence. We would like to overcome the antithesis between nominalism and realism by showing that these doctrines are not valid for relation, which can be known analogically. To the extent that the individual harbors a constitutive relation, it concerns this kind of mode of knowledge. The opposition between monism and dualism cannot endure in an apprehension of the individual. Dualism is still too monistic to be able to be conserved. It supposes a substantialism. Let's stop here because there's a section break. There's a few interesting points in this first bit. So we have this supposition or assertion that the method for studying the individual will be both ontological and epistemological at the same time. So the sort of basic idea that Simondon starts from in this text is the idea that relation has the status of being, as we saw in the introduction to Individuation Volume 1. He asserts the same thesis there. And so this thesis has both ontological and epistemological meaning or value, in the sense that so it is asserting something about what it is to be in general. So an entity is constituted in part by the relations it bears to its environment or the milieu. And then it's also epistemological in the sense that it characterizes knowledge as a relation. So because knowledge is a kind of relation, it also has the status of being. So the relationship between the knowing subject and the object known is itself a relation that has the status of being. It's something that is, and not just something that sort of represents what is in an external manner. So what we sort of need to get to, or where we need to get to, is this genesis of this relationship between subject and object, or this relationship of knowledge. We need to sort of see how this relationship can arise out of something that is not yet knowledge, and this operation of coming into being of the relationship of knowledge is sort of what this method is going to depict for us, or what is going to set out for us. Another interesting point here is the criticism of dialectics. And so this is something that we've talked about a few different times as we went through volume 1 of Individuation, where Simondon in general distinguishes what he's doing from dialectics, and he offers a few different reasons for preferring his approach, his sort of transductive method, to the dialectical method. And so one sort of distinction that he makes is that in his version of this transductive method, there's no moment of negation. So there's no so in his example of disparation of in binocular vision, for example, there's a difference between the two images. In the image, the retinal image in each eye is different from the one in the other eye, and there's this difference which brings about the perception of depth in vision. But there's no negation. So one image is not the negation of the other, and the difference between the two images is not a negation either. And so this is one sort of criterion that he proposes to distinguish transductive reasoning from dialectical reasoning. And then there's also at least one passage in the psychical individuation portion of volume 1 where he actually does characterize his own method as dialectical. So again, there's this sort of hesitation, I guess, or ambiguity in Simondon's thought in terms of how exactly his method relates to the dialectical method. And then there was the famous note 95 that we spent about half of a session, I think, going over, because it's a sort of a one-page condensation of like his whole philosophical system, essentially. And in that footnote, he doesn't explicitly use the word dialectics, but he talks about the relationship between the unity and diversity, or the one and the two, or this sort of splitting and then recombining operation. And all of these sort of images are pretty clearly dialectical modes of thinking, as far as I can tell. So again, he criticizes dialectics and distinguishes his own method from dialectics on the one hand, but then on the other hand, he also sometimes identifies his own method as dialectical, and presents these sort of schemas of thought that are apparently dialectical. So sort of an ambiguity or tension, I think, within his thought in terms of how it relates to dialectics. And then maybe one more point that I'll mention is the criticism of classificatory thinking, so thinking in terms of species and genera. So this is a common motif in Simondon's thought. He comes back to this point on a regular basis in different contexts. So in On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects, the other main book that he published in his lifetime, he criticizes a classificatory approach to technical objects that would try to assign technical objects to a species and a genus. So he criticizes this approach because he thinks that it doesn't adequately capture the technical essence of the object. So if you classify objects like you would say a mechanical clock and a digital clock are both species of the genus of clock in general. If you sort of classify them by this approach, then you have completely different sort of technical schemas or modes of operation of the digital clock and the mechanical clock. They operate under completely different principles. There's basically no analogy in terms of the actual functioning of these entities. And then he even mentions that a mechanical clock is actually more similar in terms of operation to a crossbow than it is to a digital clock. And so what he proposes instead is to understand technical objects in terms of these technical schemas, these sort of principles of functioning, as opposed to trying to classify them in terms of what the objects are for and grouping them into species and genus in terms of their function. And so, again, this sort of criticism of species and genus type classificatory thinking goes along with his criticism of hylomorphism in Volume 1 of Individuation, because, of course, the Aristotelian sort of schema of scientific thought is that you investigate objects in a particular domain, whether it's animals or plants or whatever other type of object. You sort of group them into species in terms of the form. So all of the different oak trees, for example, all have a shared form of being an oak tree. And then you would group oak trees together with I don't know, pine trees or something, and you would say that they fall under the genus of tree, or you might have more fine-grained categories than that, but you're still classifying entities in terms of their species and genus based on the form of the entity, and then each of those forms is individuated in relation to the matter that is informed by that form. So this hylomorphic schema and classificatory thinking go together for Simondon, and both are to be criticized, and we should instead use a genetic, or sometimes he calls it a constructive mode of thinking that is not hylomorphic and is not classificatory.
I just wanted to note quickly that the point about monism and dualism being too monistic because it supposes substantialism sort of, I don't know if he's making the same point here, but it sounds a bit like the way that he tries to evade Kant or get around Kant in Volume 1, where he says that the Kantian epistemology presupposes the substantial subject kind of standing apart from a substantial world, and that it's because of this substantialism that I guess relation is able to think the real in a way that isn't affected by I don't know, the Kantian arguments about epistemology, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's definitely relevant here, but I think his point is slightly different in that sentence there about dualism and monism. I think what he's talking about is, and we'll see later that he talks quite a bit in this text about Descartes. I think he's thinking of Descartes and his dualism. So the dualism between res extensa, the extended thing, and res cogitans, the thinking thing. So for Descartes, these are two sort of completely separate ontological categories. There's no relationship between the extended thing and a thinking thing. And then when he has to sort of account for the relationship between the soul and the body, he runs into the sort of difficulty of how these two completely separate substances can somehow be related, and he eventually sort of has recourse to the idea that it's a sort of incomprehensible relation. All we know is that God has ordained the world in such a way that actions of the soul bring about changes in the body, and then changes in the body can bring about perceptions in the soul. So we have a sort of experience of this connection, but we don't have any. We can't rationally grasp what this connection consists in. And then there's also the weird sort of suggestion that Descartes proposes that the action of the soul on the body has to do with the pineal gland and the motion of the animal spirits in the nervous system. So the nervous system for Descartes is a sort of hydraulic system. Or the nerves are tiny tubes that are full of this very fine substance called animal spirits, I guess a gas or something like that. And then the soul is able to, so the quantity of motion is conserved, but the soul is able to control the direction of the motion of those animal spirits without changing its quantity. And so it's by changing the direction of the motion of the animal spirits in the nerves that the soul is able to bring about motions of the body. And we'll see, Simondon will mention this doctrine a little bit later in the text. But then he points out, I think correctly, that this schema of operation is in principle unintelligible for Descartes. There's no relationship between res extensa and res cogitans, even if we take res extensa to be the most sort of fine or subtle matter, like animal spirits. That doesn't get us any further, any closer to res cogitans. And so I think it's this dualism of the res cogitans and res extensa that Simondon is pointing to here when he says it sort of supposes a substantialism. So it's this dualism of the soul and the body presupposes that the res extensa and the res cogitans are two substances. They're two sort of self-contained entities. And then the problem is, how do you actually get them to connect to each other in the way that they seem to be connected, in the fact that we are capable of bringing about movements of our body, and that we can have perceptions that are brought about by changes in our body. So what Simondon was going to want to do, and this text doesn't go in that direction. It's just a sort of methodological preliminary, but what he's going to develop in the psychical individuation section of Individuation Volume 1 is an account in which the soul and body, or the mind and body, are sort of two extreme points in the continuum, and then he wants to have a genetic account that starts from the midpoint and sort of brings about the genesis of body and mind as two extreme points, as opposed to starting from body and mind as pre-existing substances and then trying to figure out how they connect to each other. So that's sort of his methodological reversal of the substantialist order of explanation.
Right. That makes sense. It seems like it's that reversal is also tied to his rejection of Kant. But I see what you're saying about Descartes in this passage.
Yeah, and so in connection with Kant, I think the way Simondon would make that connection is that for Kant, we still have, so we don't have the Cartesian dualism in the exact sense in which Descartes proposes it, but we have a sort of alternate dualism between the transcendental subject and the empirical subject, or the empirical world, including the empirical subject. So we have there are these very strange passages in the first critique where Kant talks about how the transcendental subject has to be both identical and different from the empirical subject. There has to be this sort of hard to comprehend relationship of identity and difference of the transcendental subject and the empirical subject. And so in this relationship between the transcendental subject and the empirical subject, we have a similar kind of substantialism, in that the transcendental subject is sort of meant to be something self-contained that exists on its own or in its own right, and then it has a relationship of knowledge to the worlds, the empirical worlds, including the empirical subject. And then it's sort of accounting for what kind of relationship this could be that brings about a lot of the difficulties in Kant's system. So there has to be some sort of affection of the thing in itself on the transcendental subject that is responsible for the sensible character of experience. But as many commentators pointed out, this notion of an affection of the thing in itself on the subject seems to presuppose the category of causality, which Kant elsewhere shows only applies within the empirical world. We can only use the category of causality insofar as we apply it to empirical existence. And then so we have to sort of understand ourselves as being causally affected by entities outside of ourselves, but at the same time, we can only use the category of causation in relation to empirical existence. And so Kant runs into a similar type of problem as Descartes does when he tries to account for the relationship between the transcendental subject and the empirical subject. I think that's how Simondon would explain the relationship of Cartesian dualism to this Kantian dualism.
Yeah, that makes sense. That sounds right to me too.
Okay.
I can read the next. Oh, sorry. I can read the next
Oh
section.
yeah, sorry. I was just going to say we should go on to the next bit. So yeah, if you could read the next section to the next section heading.
Yeah, no problem. Hey, welcome, Ollie, by the way. Object of study concerning the individual. Every notion endowed with meaning by reflection can be grasped as an object of study without the need for a rigorous justification. However, the interesting choice can essentially come from two sources. The notion can be a vanishing point toward which the other problems that it involves converge. Consequently, the chosen notion is grasped as the symbol of a privileged difficulty around which other research originates. After examination, a new systematic of reflective thought becomes established, and a new typology of the philosophical universe is proposed. The problem in this way has the merit of concentrating around its formulation a plurality of interrogations in which the philosophical intention emerges. Its role is logical and normative. It seeks to bring about a conjunction of constitutive instances, whose power Bacon circumscribes within the inductive research of essences. This path is the one that Aristotle and Kant follow when they examine the nature of knowledge. Sorry, I got distracted. When they examine the nature of knowledge. But in opposition to this approach to normative and inductive logic is a usage of a problematic in which the consideration of the difficulty is the value of a principle rather than a criterion, and in which the central notion has the power to concretize into a plurality of real terms, whether they be enveloped in an anterior problematic or not. This method is the one Descartes employs when, starting from the problem of knowledge, he finds in the development of this problem the principles for the progressive construction of the world of science, savoir, knowledge was connaissance. From then on, the consideration of the genesis of the problem is merely secondary. It can be relative and arbitrary without this characteristic affecting future activity. Like decision in provisional morality, the initial notional choice is invested with a self-justifying value. It is defined by the operation that constitutes it more than by the reality it objectively seeks, like the cosmogonic hypothesis of vortices, which does not need to be true to be legitimate. Now, should I read this next paragraph too, or should we stop there?
Yeah, you can continue to the section heading.
Okay. Okay. This is the order that we would like to follow. Despite immediate appearances, it is perhaps more akin to the method of the sciences than the directly inductive method. Every developed science, like physics, reveals the capacity to progressively transform a theory into hypotheses and then into almost directly tangible realities. The prestigious work of formalizing knowledge, savoir, must not forget the no less essential capacity of the sciences to concretize the abstract by realizing it. Corpuscular theories, which are still purely abstract in Leucippus, Democritus, Epicurus, and Lucretius, passed during the 19th century to the more concrete level of specialized theories, like the kinetic theory of gases, the theory of electrolysis, the atomic theory and chemistry and the explanation of Brownian motion. Today, it is almost possible to speak of a corpuscular reality, or more exactly, a multitude of corpuscular realities, upon which technicians and researchers act in order to impose measurable and predictable accelerations, concentrations, and deviations on them. And yet it cannot be said that the progress of the sciences limits itself to the recognition of founding an old theory by verifying the hypothesis that it allows to formulate. Scientific activity has veritably constituted the concrete based on the abstract, for the concrete that verifies hypotheses is the concrete of a particular space. It is not the concrete of a fact, but of an effect that would not exist outside the universe of thought and action created by this very development of science. By constructing its object with the real, the scientific approach, albeit not logically, but nevertheless really, is self-justifying. Our desire would be to follow this second method in order to deal with the problem of the individual. Philosophical thought is not limited to an inductive investigation. To be able to itself control the validity of its approaches, philosophy must be constructive in the order of reality and action that defines it. As a return of the subject's consciousness to itself, it must operate its particular conversion of the abstract into the concrete by producing a system of axiological effects that constitute the particular self-justification of a reflexive work. The necessity of finding a way to close the cycle by way of ethics that moves from the concrete to the abstract, so as to then return to an integration into the constructed concrete, has been expressed by Plato in the image of a long detour. At the end of the Makron Hodon, philosophical consciousness is reincarnated in the sensible. Well, I don't totally understand this section, but it seems like the point about the Cartesian approach is that maybe he's referring to the idea that Descartes starts with this skepticism to reach a principle that he then uses after abandoning the skepticism to construct his own deductive system. And then maybe Simon Dunn is saying that, because in volume 1 somewhere he says that, he's just going to start with physics almost, I guess, hypothetically, to see if he can get a paradigm out of physics that can be used to explain other domains of knowledge, or individuation in other domains of knowledge, in which case the paradigm would be kind of self-justifying as a basic paradigm.
Yeah, I think this opposition between the two sort of methods in philosophy is a bit obscure. It's not entirely clear what these two methods consist in. So he calls them the inductive method, and then he says this is characteristic of Aristotle and Kant, and then the constructive method, which he takes to be characteristic of Descartes. And I think there's the few aspects of Descartes that are relevant here, that Simon Dunn talks about in other places in a bit less sort of condensed fashion, so that are helpful to understand this bit. So he talks, I believe it's in Form Information Potentials, he talks about how Descartes uses this notion of the transmission of information, or transmission of truth through reasoning. So you start from something, you start from the foundation, this incontrovertible proposition, namely that I exist in the cogito. So we have this this one absolutely certain truth, and then we can through deduction we can transmit the certainty of this truth to other propositions, and he Simon Dunn compares this to the way that a chain transmits force from one link to the next. So you have some foundation, some bedrock or whatever, and then the chain transmits force from one link to the next in such a way that the whole structure is sort of rooted in the foundation. And so Descartes' approach sort of transmits certainty or truth or whatever sort of epistemological principle we want to start from. It keeps this principle valid across the whole chain of reasoning. And the other bit of Descartes that Simon Dunn alludes to here is the this notion of a provisional morality. So Descartes, he mentions that a sort of scientific system of morality would have to wait for the completion of science. You would first have to sort of have a complete physics that would account for the nature of the world and of human beings and so on. And then on the basis of that complete science, you could sort of bring about a systematic moral philosophy. But of course, we can't sort of wait around for the completion of science before we actually act, because even refraining from acting is a kind of action. Like if we just decide I'm not going to do anything until science is completed, that's a choice, that's a decision, and so it's a kind of action as well. And Descartes uses this example of if you're lost in a forest, you don't know where, which way is the town that you're trying to reach or whatever. Then the only way to sort of get yourself out of this forest is to actually just start walking in one direction. Just keep walking in a certain direction. Eventually, you'll reach the end of the forest. But if you stay where you are, or if you change direction while you're walking, you might be stuck in the forest forever. And so there's a sort of arbitrariness in the sense that you have no idea which direction is the right one or the one that will get you out of the forest soonest. But you have to sort of arbitrarily select a direction and then just keep walking in that direction until you reach the edge of the forest. And so this sort of arbitrary decision, this principle of indifference and just selecting an indifferent direction is sort of the basis on which the whole procedure of escaping from the forest rests. And likewise in our knowledge, we have to we have a sort of arbitrary starting point in terms of the hypotheses that we select, but then we just have to sort of keep going forward in the same direction of those hypotheses and try to justify them as we go along. And so Simon Don alludes to the hypothesis of the vortices, which is Descartes' sort of principle for explanation of the solar system and everything within it. So he thinks that the solar system is basically a giant whirlpool in the subtle matter that makes up the universe. So there's a sort of whirlpool which brings about the rotation of the planets around the sun, and then there are smaller whirlpools that make the moon orbit the Earth and so on. And he explains magnetism as well through the action of these vortices. So this hypothesis is not something that you can sort of prove as a starting point. You can't sort of give evidence that there are these vortices, but what you do is you start from the hypothesis of the vortex, which is a sort of arbitrary starting point, and then you just push forward and see how many other phenomena you can explain on the basis of this hypothesis. And Descartes thinks he can explain pretty much everything in the physical world on the basis of this vortex hypothesis. Of course, that turns out not to be entirely correct, but he makes this very elaborate efforts to give explanations for all sorts of phenomena on the basis of these vortices. And so Simondon is comparing his method to this kind of self-justifying hypothesis formation. So what we want to do is not to sort of collect instances of individuals and try to see what is it that they have in common. We instead present a hypothesis about individuation and then try to use that hypothesis as a way of explaining various phenomena in the world. And so for Simondon, this sort of starting hypothesis has to do with the genetic account of individuation. So individuation is always on the basis of something pre-individual, and then there's always this complementary milieu, which is not individuated, which is a sort of remainder of that pre-individual after the process of individuation. So this sort of schema or image of what individuation consists in, he draws from various physical theories, and especially the idea of crystallization. And on the basis of this schema, he wants to try to explain individuation in all these other spheres, like vital individuation, psychical individuation, and so on. So yeah, that's sort of the idea of this self-justifying constructive method in philosophy. So the starting point is in some sense arbitrary. You can select it, just because it sounds nice or whatever other reason that is not necessarily sort of cognitively necessary. But then on the basis of this arbitrary hypothesis, you proceed to try to concretize that hypothesis to make it real in various ways.
So based on your explanation, like for me, it's like the process of ontogenesis. Like I might be wrong. What I want to say is like a Descartian like theory based, like kind of like a principle based, like the world doesn't explain all the kind of like a particular or individual phenomenon in the world. So by doing we better focus on the plurality of realities, multitude of realities. So it's like maybe like it's coming from if I understand right, and connaissance, and then it moved to this kind of if savoir more like individual knowledge, and then it doesn't stop there, and then the individual in particular related to the facts like which interact with like environments that constitutes again like the whole world, like the collective reality, and then it becomes some kind of a new kind of theoretical kind of, how do you say, theory, something like that. So it's like how do I say, like it's almost like it's like continuing process of genesis, like something like that. It sounds like to me that way. Is there anything wrong? Like anything I misunderstood?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think Simondon wants us to understand his method, his approach to philosophy as so he calls it constructive here, but elsewhere he uses the term genetic. So it's a method in which we sort of see the arising of the phenomenon that we're interested in out of something that is not yet individuated, and this is sort of the general methodological schema that he uses. So you start with something pre-individual, and then you see how that pre-individual becomes individuated in a particular way, a physical individuation or a vital individuation or whatever. And then I think you, in your comments, there was or it sort of leads me to the next point that I wanted to discuss about this notion of making real. So Simondon argues that what characterizes the history of physics in particular, but the history of science in general, is not so much a sort of process of abstraction where you would start from, say, looking at a bunch of trees, and then you would come to a concept of the tree in general, and then you would subsume that concept of the tree in general under the concept of plants in general, and so on. Having more and more abstract concepts. Instead, what he argues is characteristic of the history of science is you start from an abstract concept. So, like in Ionian physics, you have like the concept of the indefinite, for example, in Anaximander. And then you start with this abstract concept, and then that concept progressively becomes more and more concrete in the sense that it's more, it becomes more determined. It has a richer content, but also in the sense that it's something that can be operated on in a more concrete sense. So he talks here or I think a little bit later in this text, he talks about how the atomistic hypothesis in Epicurus and Democritus and Leucippus and so on was basically just an abstract theoretical hypothesis, saying that entities are made up of these tiny indecomposable sub-entities, I guess. So all the entities that we're familiar with are composites, and this was a sort of abstract hypothesis. But then when this atomistic theory gets revived in the 19th century, it becomes much more concrete in the sense that we have a statistical theory of gases, so that we can use statistical physics to predict the properties of gases in a certain pressure, volume, temperature relationship, and then even more in the 20th century and 21st century now, we have techniques for manipulating individual atoms or individual molecules. Like there was a story, I'll post the link in the chat here. There was a story just the other day about how there's a new method that allows physicists to take an individual molecule and rotate it clockwise or counterclockwise on demand. So you can sort of control the motion of an individual molecule in a very precise way. And there was also, I think it was in the 90s, there was a famous instance where some researchers who were working for IBM used individual atoms to draw the IBM logo in a 1 billionth of a centimeter or something absurd like that. In the development of physics, there's been this concretization of this atomistic hypothesis in the sense that we can actually now manipulate single atoms using these elaborate technical apparatuses that sort of incarnate the theories that were previously abstract. And so the development of science for Simondon is not one where we sort of get more and more abstract and in a sort of inductive scale, but instead we start from an abstract hypothesis and then construct something more and more concrete. And this, he wants philosophy to do the same thing by incorporating an axiology, so a system of values or a set of principles for action. So philosophy, in its sort of reflective mode, would go from the concrete to the abstract, and then it would kind of turn around and go from the abstract to the more concrete. And so this is what he calls the long detour, using Plato's phrase. So you sort of bring about a transformation of the concrete of the way that individual human beings and groups of human beings act in the world. You bring about a transformation of this action through this long detour of going through ontology and epistemology and this sort of abstract realm of philosophy, and then sort of redescending to the concrete by transforming the system of principles of action that those human beings operate on.
So what comes to my mind, like at this moment, is that like the history of science is like, as far as I understand, to try to find out some kind of a general theory to explain the phenomena in the world, which in a way like related to the Newtonian physics, like under the kind of like fixed conditions, like. But nowadays, like as you know, like quantum theory or chaos theory, whatever, which like Newtonian physics can't explain. Like along with that kind of flow of science, what Simondon found at the time was that in philosophy as well, like kind of generalizations, like to try to get rid of pull out some kind of outlier doesn't mean anything. So rather than that, like finding particularity, like based on as you explained, like a pre-individuality, like particular environments, like if we just like, for example, like a general formula applies to a particular individual, it comes out as a all different kind of phenomenon, or the expression or reaction, something like that. So what Simondon tries to do is like previous history of science or philosophy, what has been ignored. Simondon is trying to like revive its importance, significance, by emphasizing like individual psychic individuation, and then at the end of the day, it doesn't stop there. As I told you before, it goes back to the flow of like collectivity again, like which is like a little bit different kind of flow of collectivity, something like that.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to try to. Simondon had lots of remarks about individual sort of moments of history of science, but he never, as far as I know, he never has a sort of thematization of the history of science as such. He never says, history of science is a discipline that does X and that operates in this particular manner and so on. So it would be interesting to look at Simondon's account of collective individuation and then his remarks on moments in the history of science, and sort of try to put those two things together and see if you could come up with like a Simondonian account of the history of science. So science, of course, is a collective endeavor that involves this sort of unification of the work of many thousands of people over thousands of years. And so there is a kind of collective individuation that is responsible for the formation of scientific knowledge. But here, I think what he wants to get out of the history of science is this sort of schema, or this very abstract picture of starting from the abstract and going towards the concrete. It's that picture, this sort of abstract schema of increasing concreteness, I think, is what he wants to sort of adopt in philosophy as well, so that philosophical thinking would be self-justifying in the sense that it would bring about a transformation of the world. So instead of having to kind of justify what hypotheses we want to base our philosophical thinking on, we would instead have this selection of a hypothesis and this abstract starting point. And then by bringing about a transformation of the world, that philosophical reflection, that abstract starting point, would sort of justify itself by constructing a world in which it is realized. So just how the atomic hypothesis, through the history of physics, constructed a world in which scientists can in fact manipulate individual atoms. Now the task for philosophy is to construct a world in which our hypothesis of individuation out of a pre-individual, for example, is something that operates in the world, so that human beings in their action are sort of thinking of themselves and experiencing themselves in terms of individuation. So the whole schema of individuation out of the pre-individual would justify itself by transforming the way that human beings act in the world. So it's this sort of method of starting from the abstract and then justifying that abstract starting point through transformation of the world. I think that's what Simondon is trying to draw from the history of physics here.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay, so let's go on to the next section. Ollie, would you like to read from Method of Study Concerning the Individual until the next heading?
Oh, sure. Method of study concerning the individual. The preceding distinction between an inductive method, inductive method, and a constructive method excludes the possibility of an intellectual process that would start with a plurality of cases in which a problem of the individual emerges to go toward a unity of the individual's essence, a unity whose discovery could be presented as a solution to the problem. Conversely, we'll start with the simple to go towards the complex, and with the abstract to go toward the concrete. This method requires a logic, or rather a definition of criteria that would allow us to delimit the object of research in an ambiguous way. But due to the self-justifying and self-constructive cause of this thought, we cannot utilize any norm external to the chosen field of reality. This is why we have decided to start with an already constituted domain in which the norms of a valid thought have already been determined by the progress of constructive experiment. Before biology, sociology, and psychology, physics provides the example of a thought that is rich enough and formalized enough to be able to be asked to supply its own criteria of validity itself. After having tried, on the one hand, to grasp the epistemological role of the individual notion in this domain, and on the other hand, the phenomenological content or contents to which it refers, we will attempt to transfer the results from this initial test to logically and ontologically to arterial domains. If this transfer is partially or totally impossible, the knowledge of the reasons for this impossibility will have to be integrated into the position of the problem. The analogical, or paradigmatic method that this successive transfers suppose is neither founded on an ontological postulate, for example, the rationality of the real, nor on a Platonic type of universal law of exemplarism, nor on an implicit pantheistic monism. On the contrary, it is founded on the search for a characteristic structure, operation of reality that should be called individual. If this reality exists, it can be capable of different forms and levels, but should allow the intellectual transfer from one domain to another by means of necessary convergence. The notion that will need to be included to pass from one domain to the next will then the characteristic of the order of reality that comprises the content of these domains. The ontology of the individual will be disclosed by the becoming of its epistemology, and the principles of the possible axiology will be generated by this examination, insofar as it will provide a foundation for a postulation of value that can integrate an awareness of ontological reality, of epistemological signification into a single act of self-constitution.
Right. So here he further characterizes what this constructive method will be. So it's a constructive method that is also an analogical method. So I think we should consider this analogical method as a subspecies of the constructive method. And so it's analogical in the sense that we start from a domain that has its own sort of criteria of validity, namely physics. We take this schema of operation from physics. So he's thinking here, as far as I can tell, of the example of the crystal that we saw in volume 1. And so he starts from this sort of example of the crystal and the formation of a crystal, and takes this to be a paradigm that he can apply to other instances of individuation. So we can understand vital individuation, psychical individuation, and so on as analogous to the formation of a crystal in some respects, but of course it's different in other respects. And then he argues that this method doesn't require any sort of presupposition, for example, of the rationality of the real. So this is a Hegelian phrase, this idea that the real is rational. So we don't have to presuppose that the real is rational to use this method, and this has to do with the self-justifying nature of the constructive method that he talked about in the previous section. So we can use this hypothesis of or this paradigm of individuation as crystallization. We can sort of start from this instance and then proceed to sort of bring about a transformation of our thinking and action using this analogical method. And this doesn't rely on a presupposition that that the world is sort of already in line with our conceptualization of it, a presupposition that the world is rational. If we sort of run into obstacles as we try to develop this analogy, if we start from the paradigm of crystallization and then find that some element of vital individuation, for example, doesn't sort of fit with that paradigm, then we can sort of retroactively, we can apply a feedback from this obstacle to the hypothesis, and we can transform our hypothesis. And so there's this sort of self-correcting nature to this methodology, in the sense that the obstacles that we run into, or the problems that we run into as we try to apply this paradigm, can sort of feed back into our understanding of the paradigm itself. So if we find that vital individuation doesn't fit exactly with how we had previously understood crystallization, then we can use this understanding of vital individuation to transform our understanding of crystallization. And so it's sort of, there's a sort of feedback nature to the operation and self-correcting nature to this operation. And it's in this sense that our understanding of the ontology of the individual, so what it is to be an individual, will be disclosed by the becoming of its epistemology, is how he puts it. So by trying to apply this paradigm from physics, and then having to transform our initial understanding of that paradigm when we run into obstacles, and then sort of repeating this process over and over again, we come to have a better and better understanding of what it is to be an individual in the first place. And then by virtue of carrying out this process, we develop a kind of axiology, so a system of values. So we set out an understanding of what a human individual is, and how a human individual is individuated, and then that understanding will transform our understanding of values and of the principles of action, and then we can have, again, that sort of feedback relationship between the principles of action and our understanding of the human individual. And so there's a kind of reciprocal determination of the axiology and the ontology of the human individual.
I wonder what Simon Dunn would say to an objection that, he really isn't starting without any presuppositions if he's taking kind of these the results of experiments in physics as a starting point for his ontology. It seems like there are some philosophers who are pretty adamant about starting without any presuppositions whatsoever, and it seems like they would be critical of the idea of starting with just sort of assuming that physics can offer a valid paradigm for, I don't know, ontogenesis in general.
Yeah, I think the way Simon would answer to that is that what he's doing is not he's not trying to have an entirely presuppositionless starting point. He's not trying to say that we can start from zero presuppositions and then sort of pull ourselves up from our own bootstraps and then like get ourselves into the system of knowledge without presupposing anything. I think what he wants to say here is that we don't have to make any ontological presuppositions about how the world is, or what the structure of the world is, or anything like that at the outset of applying this method. We can use this paradigmatic method without having any presupposition that, for example, the world is structured in such a way that our conceptual categories are sort of mirrored in the world, or anything like that. We can, because this method has this self-justifying and self-correcting nature, we can start from a sort of arbitrary hypothesis that may or may not reflect the way the world is, and then we can use that hypothesis to transform the world, and then likewise have that feedback transformation of our hypotheses in relation to the world. And then in the case of physics in particular, I think what Simon Dunn would say is that physics is also a kind of self-justifying enterprise, in the sense that physicists don't need philosophers to sort of make their work valid, or to give the foundations to their work that would be lacking without philosophers. So physics is a extremely successful enterprise where physicists are able to produce these theories and then bring about transformation of the world in such a way that those theories are realized, in things like manipulating individual atoms and so on. So this whole enterprise of physics is self-justifying. It's this elaborate process through which theories and technical objects are constructed and corrected and improved and so on. And it doesn't require philosophers to come in and sort of prove that this whole enterprise is valid in the first place. And then so what we're doing by taking this paradigm from physics is not so much saying that we know that this paradigm is valid because it's used in physics. What we're doing instead is taking an example or an exemplar from a domain that has already produced this sort of formalized knowledge. So this very abstract knowledge, physics as it's practiced now involves some pretty advanced mathematics and is very remote from, say, like our immediate experience of the natural world. And so you can start from this very abstract paradigm drawn from physics, and then you can proceed to concretize it by transforming the world and then having that feedback nature of the world transforming our concepts as well. And so physics here is just a sort of example of a field that, or a human enterprise that has produced this very abstract schema of thought that we can take as a starting point and then apply this self-correcting method to it. And so we could just as well take another domain of knowledge if we felt like that domain of knowledge was sufficiently formalized or sufficiently abstract to serve as a starting point. So physics here is chosen just because it has that degree of abstractness that we can start from and then proceed to concretize it.
I have question of the expression of a unity of individual essence, unity whose discovery could be presented as a solution to the problem. Here, a unity of individual essence, what does it refer to? Is it kind of like does it have to do with kind of Spinozian kind of unity, something? Actually, I have no particular specific idea on that, but I'm just wondering, like, here unity is like something beyond the individual domain, and then if possible, second question is like, Simondon's like a views perspective on this all kind of ideas. Can you say like anthropocentric? Like here, I mean individuals. I mean, he focuses on individuals, so that should be human beings. And then, can you say like his ideas like really anthropocentric? And then, I didn't totally read a technical object or other book like Dumont or something like that. And then regarding like like a speculative like the philosophy, which is like currently like a quite popular one, like objects for him, like what does it mean by that? So question goes to go three. Like first one is like the meaning of unity of individual essence, and the second one is like his idea is like anthropocentric. Third one is like objects. So what does it mean to him?
Right. Yeah. So that first bit about the unity of the individual's essence. So here he's talking about the inductive method, the one that he doesn't want to follow. So, and the one that he attributes to Aristotle and Kant. So he says in this method, we start from a bunch of problems about individuals or about the nature of the individual. We take these individual problems or this set of problems, and then we try to find a sort of unity of the individual's essence, where the this one sort of conception of the nature of the individual would solve all of these different problems at the same time. So we might have a problem of individuation in the physical realm, and then in the vital realm and the psychical realm, and so on. We might have all these different problems of the individual, and then we would try to find a sort of general concept of the individual that would apply to each of these realms and solve all of these problems at the same time. And so for Simondon, this is not what he sort of wants to do as his method. He wants to instead start from a paradigm instance in physics, and then sort of proceed to concretize that paradigm, that abstract paradigm, and then use the sort of self-correcting, self-realizing character of the theory to go forward. So instead of collecting a bunch of examples and then finding a general sort of unity or a general solution to all these problems, we start from one type of problem and then try to apply the schema of thought that it generates to other problems. So yeah, that first bit is he's talking about the inductive method, which is not the one that he wants to follow. And then the second question about anthropomorphism, I think for Simondon, what he would say is that what he's doing is not anthropomorphic in the sense that he starts from an extremely abstract physical paradigm, which has nothing in particular to do with human beings. So, crystallization is something that as far as we know, happened long before any human beings or even any living beings existed on Earth. There was crystallization in the early days of the Earth, when it was in the first billion years or so, when there were no living beings. And there's presumably crystallization going on the moons of Jupiter or wherever, other planets outside our solar system. So this whole schema of crystallization, yes, that's the archifossil of Meillassoux. So this whole system of crystallization, or this whole schema of crystallization, is something that is independent of any sort of human process of individuation or any connection to the human individual as such. And we can take this very abstract schema of the formation of a crystal, and we can use it to understand other domains of individuation, including human individuation. And so it's almost a reverse of anthropomorphism, in the sense that we are using a physical schema to understand human beings, as opposed to using a human sort of image to understand crystallization. So we're trying to understand individuation on the basis of this physical schema, and applying this physical schema to other domains of individuation. And this schema is something that doesn't have anything in particular to do with human beings. And then the last question, quickly, about the object. So he, in the other main book, is on the mode of existence of technical objects. And so in that book, he I think is also doing a kind of counter anthropomorphic exercise, in the sense that he wants to understand technical objects as having reality outside of or having existence that is not dependent on human uses for those technical objects. So there's a schema of operation of a technical object that is independent of what particular use we might have for that technical object, and how that technical object is sort of inserted into human interests and desires. And so he talks about, for example, how in the evolution of the car, the sort of basic technical schema is in some senses obscured by the addition of all kinds of sort of conveniences, like power steering, power windows, etc. All these things that make cars more sort of consumer friendly, as opposed to developing the actual technical schema of a car. And so this sort of evolution of the car to be more consumer friendly is a sort of humanization of the car. It's a kind of insertion of the car into human desires, into this framework of human desires. And he also, connects this with the whole industry of marketing, that power windows are represented as being sort of an instance of progress and the development of technology, and then that turns manual windows into something that seems antiquated. And this all has to do with the way that cars are marketed to consumers, as opposed to an actual development of the technical schema of a car as such. And so what I think Simondon is trying to do is to sort of purify that technical essence of a car or technical schema of a car, and separate it from its insertion into human social relations and human desires and so on. And so grasping technical objects without having to sort of relate them to human desires and interests.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I would think about that more, and then very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Maybe since Angus has to go, maybe we can stop here for today and just do another shorter session next time where we can finish the this text. We have, I think, about 4 pages left. How does that work for everyone?
Yeah,
that sounds good.
Yeah, good. Then next time, then that will be next year, right?
Yes, I think so. Let me just take a look. So that would be possibly January 1st. Let's discuss that in the chat. We can just see if everyone's available on January 1st. If not, we can try for the 2nd, for the Monday after. But let's discuss that over the chat in the next couple of days.
That sounds good.
Okay.
I was just gonna say, I don't think I had really realized until I read, that Heidegger and the Kant and Meillassoux, just how it seems like Simondon is just he's sort of totally the other end of the spectrum in terms of, Heidegger would emphasize the kind of everyday human aspect as being kind of the primordial, the most original, I guess, mode of the being of objects. Whereas for Simondon, it's almost like seen from the outside of that viewpoint, where you're looking at the car as purely present at hand and purely kind of I don't know. It's almost from the viewpoint of the machine itself, independently of the I guess more artisanal and human phenomenological viewpoint, I think.
Yeah, I think that's mostly right. But what I would say, I think, is that for Simondon, so he doesn't want to treat the car necessarily as present at hand, in the sense that it would be a sort of an object of knowledge. It would be something that sort of sits there independently of us as knowing subjects that sort of look at it from outside. What he wants to do is to look at the functioning of the car and abstract this sort of schema of functioning of the car, or a schema of operation of the car. So he talks about this technical essence that has a genesis through a lineage, in the sense that a technical object like a car is the product of earlier research into internal combustion engines. So there's a whole history of internal combustion engines and how that is realized in the car, and that lineage might pass through various other kinds of technical objects. Like he talks about how old car engines can actually be removed from the car and used to power a boat instead. They're sort of versatile and can be applied to other domains of human needs or human desires. So he wants to sort of abstract this technical essence of a technical object, and that technical essence is something that's never sort of fully realized in a particular technical object. It's something that is becomes more and more concrete as a technical lineage progresses. So in early internal combustion engines, you have like the cylinder and then a radiator separate from the cylinder, which serves to diffuse heat. And then in later, more concrete internal combustion engines, you have the cylinder has sort of veins in it that serve the same function of diffusing heat, but they're part of the cylinder itself. So that instead of having like two abstract entities that have independent functions within the whole, you have one more concrete entity that has multiple functions. And so he takes this to be the sort of the general principle of evolution of technical objects. They become more and more concrete. They sort of realize the technical essence in this more concrete form as opposed to this abstract form that you start with. So this technical essence is something that we can only grasp by tracing the history of that technical lineage. And it's not something that is sort of manifest to us just by looking at a car, or even if you sort of take apart the engine or something like that. You have to trace the whole history of evolution of that car.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's not. I can see how the present at hand notion doesn't really apply to that.
Yeah, and it's, that whole book. I mean, we did a whole reading group on that before we started Individuation, but it's a very interesting book, not just for its sort of analysis of technical objects, but then also part 3. I think is the most interesting part of the book. It's a sort of genetic anthropology, where he gives a I think he is thinking of Heidegger to some extent there in this notion of modes of existence or modes of being in the world for the human being. But he gives an account of how these different modes of existence are sort of genetically related to each other. How so starting from the most basic mode of existence, which he identifies with magic, the magical mode of existence sort of splits into religion and science, and then each of those splits in turn. So yeah, as a sort of genetic anthropology, where each mode of existence brings about a split into alternate modes of existence.
That's really interesting, especially in light of the science and faith thing in Volume 1, where they are seen as incomplete halves of what should be, I guess, a unified process.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's a sort of recurring theme in his work. This kind of not a unification of two opposites, but finding the starting point out of which those two opposites are generated and become opposites in the first place. I think that's like a sort of general methodological principle for him to try to find that starting point between two opposites out of which they're generated.
Right. Yeah. That aspect of Simondon always makes me think of Derrida as well. So that seems like Derrida is always kind of trying to do the same thing, it seems.
Yeah, my knowledge of Derrida is pretty limited, but I think that would be interesting to try to compare the two and see, to what extent their methods are similar and to what extent they're different. I know Stigler is someone who works on Derrida's work and Simondon's work at the same time, and sort of uses both together. So maybe that would be a place to look to try to identify to what extent their methods are similar or different.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I've been meaning to. Someday I will have time to pick up technics in time.
Yeah, I have it on my list as well. I haven't. I've only read a little bit of Stigler, and don't really know his work well.
Yeah, same.
But yeah, so if there's no other comments or questions, then I guess we can close today's session and then pick up and try to finish this text next time.
That sounds good.
Okay, great. So thanks for coming out, and hope to see you next week.